Hello and welcome back, and for those of you that have followed the channel for a while, you know that when it comes to any brand that's starting to make its tippy toes into the world of NAS, I'm all ears. GMKTec are a brand that have been knocking around for a long time in the mini PC world, just like a lot of the more recent entries into the world of NAS in the last 12 to 18 months, and this is their first pretty much solely focused network attached storage solution. This is the G9. It is a 4-bay M2 NVMe flash server. It arrives with the brand new Intel N150 CPU, released at least for production in Q1 2025. This thing is stupidly hot off the presses as a processor there, designed for efficient server utilization. This also is a dual OS system, rocking out with either a Windows license or without the Windows license. They're on board of Windows 11, but also alongside that, Ubuntu via an output there on a 64 gig internal eMMC output as well. A little storage drive there, I should say, which allows you to run this both with Ubuntu, so Linux, and either Windows or your third-party NAS operating system of choice, your Unraid, your true NAS. More on that later on. Rocking out the gate in a variety of different configurations. You can get this with no additional storage inside, so just the memory that's inside, 12 gig of DDR5, LPDDR5, more on that later on. But you can also get it with a 1 TB drive, and it starts at $168 from the price I've seen online at their own site, scaling up with a 1 TB drive inside at $216. So for a 4-bay flash system, and of course that doesn't include your tax and your delivery, that is an incredibly impressive and attractive price point, particularly with that Twin Lake CPU. Add to that the fact that this is a 4-bay M2 NVMe system, and that's pretty impressive. Even if you remove the 1 TB drive option there and you're rocking out at the 160, 170 mark, this is already going to be quite the good value proposition. Keeping in mind, of course, this is not a turnkey NAS solution in the traditional sense. Yes, the Ubuntu software is included, but that is free anyway. You can get that online for yourselves. And moreover from that, Ubuntu, although it can be used for server deployment there and a traditional storage, I think most users when it comes to NAS wouldn't use it as the primary or the most desired NAS operating system out there. You can manage your storage, but as NAS software go, you're going to have to go a little step further. So I'm reluctant to call this turnkey. But first up, let's talk about the design, because I will say, as much as I like the majority of this system, and I will go through some of the stuff that I don't like later on, I will say the design, although compact, definitely feels like $160 to $200 NAS. What do I mean by that? Well, it's almost exclusively plastic externally. Now, that wouldn't be, an exception to the rule. I think the majority of NAS solutions in desktop form, and particularly compact form, are generally quite plastic on the outside, metal on the inside. But with an M2 NVMe flash system, there are compromises. What do I mean? Well, the top being plastic, fine. There's a laptop fan based on top of that N150 CPU inside there, and there's ventilation there on that. And on the base, there's 2 more fans over here. So what's my beef? Well, the M2 NVMe slots are in here, and this panel is plastic. That is a huge missed opportunity as far as I'm concerned, where that should have been metal for heat dissipation. Those 4 NVMe's there, this system doesn't arrive with any additional cooling plates, doesn't arrive with any heatsink plates there. You can get SSDs that have got the heatsink plate included, and dare I say that the 1 TB drive model of this does arrive with an SSD that has a heatsink pre-attached there, the rubber band heatsink. But I will say there are no additional heat plates included with that kit there. And given the fact that when I had this set up, I had it set up with this plastic plate, even though I had thermal pads attached to heat sinks and I tested with and without, I will say that they really missed an opportunity there by having this plate not be metal to aid some of that heat dissipation. And the fact that the fans here do feed directly into the SSDs there, but not in the best possible way, does result in a NAS system that when it was in operation, temperature management wasn't the best. Now, thanks once again, we talked about this in previous videos, to HIC Micro with a Mini V2 here, which allowed us to check the the temperature thermal stats on this device when he had it in operation. And I've got to say, notwithstanding the readings we got from Unraid that told us a little bit more about this system when it was on over time, When we did some of our consistent read-write checks that I'm going to talk about later on, I will say the temperatures were not ideal during peak use. When it was idle, it was fine. But the temperature when the system was, even light to medium use across all of the drives, it strongly indicated that you are 100% going to need heatsinks for SSDs inside this. And given the 9-lane CPU inside this, that's kind of surprising. I will say again, for the price point, something you're going to hear a lot in this video, cheap. I'm really happy, but there's no way I can say that this is a particularly ruggedly put together SSD enclosure for a flash NAS. Now, noise when the system was in operation was actually really good. When we had it connected up with the drives being accessed, all 4 drives having read and write activity happening on them, the noise levels were really small, in the 30s dBA there, very rarely peaking into the 40s, and that was when all 3 fans were active. It dropped even lower than that when the system was in idle. Keep in mind that depending on the NAS software that you choose to use, the level of control you have over those fans will vary, and you may have to use plugins or third-party apps, but I will say, in terms of noise, this thing was near silent, and for a 3-fan NAS system, it was even more impressive. Likewise, power consumption, we expected it to be low anyway because this is running on that new Twin Lake N150 CPU there, and when the system was in idle, so that was when the CPU was dipping between 0 to 5%, it was occupying with all 4 SSDs connected there and 2 LAN connections, it reached 19 to 20 watts. Not the lowest, but for a CPU that has a TDP of around 6 watt, when it's in complete idle, for 4 SSDs on top of that, I was okay with that. When all 4 drives were being accessed simultaneously, again, this is via the USB-C, I should say, 65 watt PSU, it achieved around 28 to 30 watts. And again, that was with the CPU always living between 25 and 50%. So again, not bad numbers for an active 4-bay M2 NVMe server. Now, the storage capabilities in there's a few things we have to note there. Number one, those 4 M.2 NVMe slots are down to Gen 3 times 2. That means you've got around 2 gigabits per second potential performance for each of those drives. Again, that does whittle down normally to between 1.5 to 1.6 gigabytes per second there, read and write. Now, we went in via Unraid terminal to check the performance of those individual M2 NVMe's, and I've got good and weird news. The good news, when it came to read performance of 1 gigabyte repeated transfers, we saw the drives hit 1.4 to 1.5 gigabytes per second each, which is more than respectable for a CPU like this and a framework like this. We could have rated them together, but do keep in mind that this is a system running on 2.5 gigabit Ethernet ports, more on that later on. So external performance and RAID performance with that CPU would have been negligible. However, when it came to write performance, notwithstanding the temperature increases that we've already mentioned earlier on with these individual drives, and you can almost make out, and fairly certain when you look at some of the screens right now that show which of the SSDs had heatsinks and which didn't, I will say the performance numbers for write peaked at around 400 to 500 megs, and it wasn't that long before they started going down to your 200 to 300. Now, I dug in a little bit more into the PCIe layout of this device, and it had numerous PCIe Gen 2 split controllers there, the ASM1182E, a Gen 2 packet switch. Now, I think that is where we saw some throttling there internally. Now, you're not going to realize a lot of that performance, as this is a 2 times 2.5 gigabit Ethernet external port there. And even though it was throttled by those little Gen 2 downgrade switch ports there, and each one of those packet switches, by the way, was on a 5 giga transfers times 1 lane there, which gives you, again, for each of them, around 400 to 500 megs to play with anyway. So again, 0.4 to 0.5 gigabytes per second. I will say that it does mean that even if you did RAID those individual M2 NVMe's together, whether it was because of the packet switches or the handling of that CPU of each of those during the write operation, you're not going to see tremendous external performance here in a RAID. I will say, again, at that price point, I'm okay with it, because again, you're talking about something that is going to be sub $250 for a 4-bay NVMe. They're giving you way more than I expect for that price point, but I can't say that it is perfection encapsulated. Also, as mentioned, while we're talking about storage, it's worth keeping in mind, as mentioned earlier on, that the Ubuntu OS on this arrives pre-created. It's already got a login there. The password, I believe, was 12345. You can change that, obviously. That arrived on a 64 gig eMMC there, which I think you could probably overwrite, but it's not a huge amount of storage. I wouldn't, install TrueNAS on it or anything like that. And if you're going to run something like Unraid, which will run from a USB, quite simply, that's what I did on this. It was absolutely fine. But do keep in mind that if you do buy the 1 TB bundled version of this that I was sent from GMKTec, again, they haven't paid for this, they just sent the unit. These views are my own. But when they do include the 1 TB model, it arrives as its own M2 NVMe, and it will occupy one of those M2 NVMe slots. Do remember that. It's not the end of the world. You've still got 3 slots to play with there. But if you're going to run a NAS operating system like TrueNAS that needs an OS drive, unlike Unraid, you're going to lose out. There isn't another like 2230 or 2242 length M2 NVMe slot inside. Now, ports and connections on this, we have got a plethora of USB ports. There's 4 USB 3.2 Gen 2 connections at 10 gigs per second there on each of them. Now, keep in mind, 3 of them are USB Type A, all bundled there on the end, and we have an additional USB-C one. This can also be used as a visual output as well, alongside 2 4K 60 frames per second HDMI outputs there. And there is an additional USB, but that USB is there for your power input with that external PSU we mentioned earlier. Now, the NICs there are both copper, again 2.5 gigabit Ethernet, so you're looking at around 279 for each of them, and there is more than enough internal bandwidth, I believe, to saturate them, whether they are independently in different networks or, priority failover, or if you want to lag them together on something like SMB multi-channel. When we did do tests on the individual ports, we saw both of them oversaturating the 2.5 gigabit very easily there, so you're not going to have any limitations. However, there are going to be some users disappointed at the lack of 10 GBE. I'm not defending the brand here. I would have liked to have seen a 10G version of this. I do believe, given that the N100 and the N305, all the Lake processors, they've started rolling out NAS Mobo for 10 gig. I think on this, they clearly made a choice to prioritize the storage, and those, ASM packet switches there have definitely had to cut things up a lot. But it would have been nice to see a 10G version of this, maybe make it $100 more expensive. Maybe that's something they'll do afterwards, but just keep in mind there is no methodology to add 10 GBE conventionally. But of course, because of the 4 M2 NVMe slots, you could take advantage of something like an M.2 to 10G adapter. We've talked about them on the channel before, or an M.2 to Occulink adapter. But keep in mind, again, you're running at Gen 3 times 2 lanes here, and you're going to be running through those packet switches. So it really reduces the scope there. Now, we do need to take a moment to talk about that CPU there. That CPU, the N150, is the refresh of the N100 processor there. There is also an N355 as well. Now, that is a quad-core processor there. It's got around a gigahertz general performance there that can be burst when needed, as a lot of these modern server-class efficient CPUs do. They can clock it up to 3.6 gigahertz when needed, with 1 gigahertz integrated graphics burst when needed. It's quad core, 4 cores, 4 threads, and as mentioned, it's a 6-watt TDP processor there. Now, the system arrives with 12 gig of pre-attached memory inside. You can't upgrade that, and although that is kind of annoying, it is a decent amount of LPDDR5 memory, so low power consuming more efficient DDR5 memory included, so more than the average. A lot of systems might roll out at that price point with 4 or 8 gig, and although you can't upgrade it, that CPU only supports up to 16 gig, so I'm inclined to be a little nice to them on that score. Also, it's no non-ECC, but 1, that CPU was never going to support it. 2, at that price point, argue bonkers, there was never going to be ECC support. So on the one hand, if you're looking for ECC, this is not for you, but at the same time, I do struggle to criticize them for not having it at this price point, which again, I know I'm being repetitious of, but you have to frame this within that scope. Likewise, criticizing this on its software is tricksy because, you can't really criticize them for the Ubuntu because they don't make it, and the fact that it includes it is still one step ahead of a lot of mini PC to NAS portfolio expansion from a lot of brands in this space and this NUC box. They keep calling it a NucBox. There wasn't a lot of the word NAS on a lot of the original marketing of this device, something I found very, very weird given it's clearly a NAS profile device. On top of that, again, the Windows software includes, you've got a full Windows 11 Pro license there included with it, and the drive that it arrives with has got it all up and running. Most users are probably not going to use it. And I can't really criticize it much for when you run something like Unraid on it, because it doesn't include Unraid. A lot of that comes down to Unraid and their own software. I will say, if you are going to run this with Unraid like I was doing, a lot of the controls like fan control there and a lot of the power switching stuff is going to be dependent on Unraid and the add-ons and the apps that you add. There's very little NAS control built into this by default because it is marketing itself more as a mini PC with a Linux OS on board that you can use as a NAS if you choose. So no score draw on that maybe. But ultimately, for the price point, it's really hard to fault this. The design, I would argue there are better options out there. I think heat dissipation and heat disbursement on this requires some extra work. Again, whether that is good heatsinks or even, you know, fan-assisted heatsinks aren't really going to be on the table here, but using normal heatsinks on here are still going to be combating against a plastic panel there, which has a tendency to capture some of that heat, which is going to overburden the work for those little fans. But if you're not going to be hammering this rather efficient and again very affordable system, I'm, you know, reluctant to go too hard and heavy on this. GMKTec here have released an affordable NAS solution here, and as long as you look at it in the right guise and you understand the limitations that hardware profile provides, it's a decent enough little NAS system. I'm looking forward to seeing if GMKTec can scale this up considerably more, perhaps with a SATA equipped system or a 10GB alternative that takes care of some of that heat dissipation concern that I have. But, you know, for the broad strokes, for its price, it's definitely a little NAS flash system I would recommend for those looking to dip a toe into SSD, M2, NVMe optimized NAS systems that are concerned about power consumption and are concerned about more modest systems, you know, in their operational environment having a lesser impact on power consumption, noise, stuff like that. Do I like it? Yes. Do I think I'd recommend it? Only to entry-level and very small home lab users, maybe very light SMB, home users, prosumers certainly. But thank you so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this. Let me know what you guys think. Maybe you've got a hold of one of these. Maybe you want to see a follow-up on this where we make a comparison against some of the beefier systems in the market just to see where the extra hundreds of pounds are spent. But apart from that, there's a written review as well, linked over on NAS Compares below. And if you are interested in getting hold of one of these and you were going to shop at one of the shops I've listed below in the description, please use those links. It helps us keep doing what we do. And I've linked to a few different retailers, if you know, as soon as it becomes available, so do check those out. But apart from that, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.